Welcome to the Pfizer Podcast. My name is Louise Duffy, and in this series, we will explore how to prepare for an interview for the role of consultant or specialist registrar. In this second episode, I speak to Lorcan Nyan, Head of Training, and Barry McLaughlin, Senior Training Consultant, both from the Communications Clinic. We discuss interview preparation with a focus on answering competency-based questions. Lorcan and Barry, welcome to the podcast. Now, we're going to talk about some of the key questions that could arise in a medical interview, and they are competency-based questions. So, Lorcan, if I could start with you, what are the key competencies that could be expected in a consultant interview?
A competency question is any question where the panel is saying, can you do this thing for us? Can you deliver in this area? So that can be the more traditional competencies of, can you communicate well? Do you have good leadership skills? Do you have good organizational skills? Can you deal with conflict? But it can also be, can you deliver on the level of research that we need? Can you run an effective audit? Can you present internationally? So any question, when you look at the role, when you look at the panel, when you have discussions with the panel, that is, here's what they need me to do or deliver, here's the skill that they need, that's what you should see as a competency. The traditional competencies are communication, organization, but anything they need you to be able to do is a competency.
And how do you identify those competencies if you're preparing for a consultant interview?
A couple of different ways. One of them is your own experience, whether you're internal or external, you know the role that you're applying for, you know what is required of you. So you need to think from that perspective of, if I was on the panel, if I was on the other side, what would I be looking for? There is then also the spec of the job that they've given you, the forms you've filled out in advance will have some of the competencies, the standard ones of communication skills, organization skills, leadership. And then for an interview like this, research, audit, presentation are always constants that you need to be ready for. So think about the role, think about what they're looking for. They are the competencies that you need to be ready for.
Okay, so Barry, when you have identified all of the key competencies, you've gone through the job description, you've anticipated what could possibly come up, what's your next step then in preparation?
Well, the first thing is you need to work off the principle, show me, don't tell me. In other words, that if you're asked a question about a competency, you know your own examples well enough to demonstrate that you can carry out the skill. So, for example, Lorcan mentioned there about an audit. And if you're asked about your audit experience, there's no point in talking about it in the abstract. You need to be able to talk about the type of audits you've done, how successful they've been, what the impact has been, and essentially what you've learned from the audit experience, so that you're actually adding value every time you're giving an example or a story. So looking at the competencies that Lorcan has identified, whether it's on the application form or whether you know what is actually relevant for the role, you need to have at least one good example that best demonstrates that particular competency. And if you're deciding what examples to select, you should first of all work off the basis, well, what ones are successful, what ones are at an appropriate level, and if all else fails, think about the ones that you learned the most from. What was something that worked really well that you were subsequently able to carry through as a behavior? So in terms of the competencies, having good examples with very good outcomes is actually a critical place to start. The other thing you need to think about is, how are you going to say and give the examples in the way you want to? And I suppose, again, you work off the principle, how do I know what I'm going to say until I hear myself say it? So it's really important that you get yourself verbally familiar with giving your own examples, with telling your own stories, and getting to the outcome as well. And it's like anything that you have to develop a skill in. The more you practice it, the more you say it out loud, the much more likely you are to remember it when you're under pressure in an interview.
And is there a particular structure then you would advise, Barry?
Yes, there is a structure that gives people the best chance to actually get those key points across. So the first thing you need to say is that generally, yes, you can actually carry out that competency. So if, for example, you're asked about audit, be ready to launch into a positive answer straight away, that you have experience in this area and you know how to do it. Then you give your example. And when giving your example, make sure you're giving the scale and the scope of it. Because oftentimes people would undersell their examples, that they don't, for example, talk about maybe the amount of time that they put into the audit, or the number of people involved, or maybe the time pressure they were under to have an audit done and carried out correctly. Then make sure you get to an outcome, that the outcome is positive, that you carried out the audit appropriately, it was done on time. And if there was any external validation of the audit or improvements that came in as a result of it and that were subsequently proven in a future audit, make sure you get those out as well. And I think the key thing that separates really good candidates in interviews are those candidates that can actually say why they did that well. So if you think about your structure being absolutely, I can demonstrate this skill, I'm going to give you a really good example, I'm going to give you a very clear outcome, but I'm also going to tell you what are the things that I did that led to that success. And that then demonstrates to an interview panel that actually this person not only can do this, they know how they've done it well, and that is evidence that they can relate that back to the role and repeat it at a future date.
Okay, Barry. And Lorcan, Barry mentioned the scale and scope of the example. How much information is too much information when you're relaying an example?
Yeah, it's one of the more difficult things, and it's one of the things that we would see from clients all the time that they struggle with, of how minor and minute must I go into the detail here, and they find themselves in a rabbit hole of trying to tell this full, long, linear, chronological story that actually took place over 6 months, and they give us every kind of weave of the story. And that's very difficult for the panel to listen to easily and to take away the key information. So I could not agree more with Barry about the scale and the scope being the absolute key. And I think the best way to get that across for people is to start your example with the before picture. What was the situation that you were in? What did it look like at the very, very start? What challenge was facing you? How did everything look before you got involved? And how difficult was it? Then you move on to the action piece. What did you do? What were the 3 or 4 overarching major things that you did? Not every single conversation you had. What were the 3 or 4 overarching actions you took? And then, as Barry said, you then hit the outcome, or the happy ever after. The how well did it go? So if you think about it in 3 blocks for your story, what was the before picture? How difficult was it? What was the catalyst for change? What did you do? And then how well did it go? What was the outcome? What is the happy ever after? That's how any major story is told, should be told. Think of any sporting underdog story that you've ever heard. It's consistently, they were up against it. How unlikely was their success? They were odds on to be relegated. Everybody thought they were going to come last. What did they do? The tactics they used, the different way they approached the game. What was the end result? They won the championship. It's the same in your story: before, action, after.
And we all understand the collaborative environment that is every workplace. How do I come alive through the telling of my story if it was a team effort, if I was just one of many getting through this?
It depends on the circumstance of the story. People do have a tendency to fall into the we, that they talk in we language. Because look, in everything outside of an interview, that's a really good trait to have. You're collaborative, you want to work with others. In an interview, it's not necessarily all I, me. But what's important for the panel is that they understand, what are you responsible for? What was on you? And therefore, what do you deserve credit for? So you need to establish that early. After the before picture, there needs to be, what was your role? If you were leading the audit, let's say, we need to hear, I led a team of 4 people through this process. Once that's clear, then you can start talking about we and the team, because we knew that the buck stopped with you. So where was your responsibility, and therefore where is your credit? You need to establish that early in your story.
And Barry, what are the other common problems that you see people make when answering a competency-based question?
Sometimes they maybe don't apply that structure that Lorcan has talked about, that you're not sure if there's a beginning, a middle and an end. And there is no such thing as an answer that is too short or too long, but there are plenty of answers that become irrelevant very quickly. So it's thinking about, am I telling and giving all the information that I need to make sure that I can actually demonstrate to this interview panel that I can do the job. One thing that sometimes we see people struggle with is that they look at the competencies and they're thinking, I didn't actually do that, or I haven't been involved in that because it's not part of my job. And I think anybody who works in the health service and has worked as a doctor or a medic knows that you often have to take on other responsibilities at short notice. So, for example, we all see what's happening with COVID at the moment, and everyone's working really hard. So maybe your best example can be that situation where informally you were in charge or you had to step in because there was nobody else available to do the job at the time. So I suppose don't sell yourself short. Just because the job has not been assigned to you, think about the examples maybe where you had to do that bit extra, where you had to take more responsibility. Those examples, if you can remember them, practice them, and demonstrate to the interview panel that under pressure you did a really good job, those examples can be just as valuable and memorable from the interview panel's point of view.
And when you're practicing and you're preparing for these questions, should you be looking at the clock to see how much time you need to dedicate to an answer of this type, Lorcan?
No, you should be looking at really, what's my objective? What do I need to get across? So for a competency question, you need to leave the panel at the end of your answer with a clear idea of, I have a load of experience doing this, that strong statement Barry talked about. Here's an example you'll remember and understand where the circumstances were difficult or at a high level, and I delivered really well. And look, I can do it again, which is the here's how I did it piece at the end that Barry talked about. That's your objective. This person has loads of experience. There's a good story. They can do it again. How long does it take you to hit that objective? Not how long must I talk or how long do I have? How long does it take me to concisely and accurately hit that objective? Tend to find it's going to take you 2 to 3 minutes. It might take you shorter. It might take you longer. But base yourself on your objective. What are you proving? What do you need to get across? And on that then as well, just around that whole area of the examples you choose to add to what Barry said, well, I have a tendency to find with clients sometimes that they worry that their examples aren't good enough, aren't at the level, aren't, huge game-changing stories and events, and therefore they can't use them. But you need to remember as well that they're called competencies. You need to prove that you're competent at the skill, at the task. So it doesn't necessarily have to be the hospital or the department or the ward was totally different and will never be the same again after you were finished. But as long as it was at the scale needed and you did a good, strong, outcome-orientated job, then that example, that competency example, is absolutely valid. It needs a strong outcome, but don't overthink it either.
And then scenario-based questions can often arise as well, Barry. So what's the best way to handle them?
Yes, these questions, and we in the time I've certainly been working with clients, and I'm sure Lorcan has been the same as well, they've come to us with different scenarios that they know are going to come up or that they would expect to be asked. So scenarios are often that question, what would you do in this situation? And the ones that often come up include things like where you maybe observe a colleague behaving in an inappropriate way, maybe not dealing with a patient in the right way. Or maybe you're in a situation where you have to communicate with a patient or a family in difficult circumstances. The danger is that we see some candidates turn the answer into the hypothetical. This is what I would do in theory. And they give a very, very good textbook's answer in terms of listening skills or whatever it is for communication, or what the appropriate steps to take when dealing with a colleague are. But what the interview panel will be more impressed with are, first of all, somebody who can actually demonstrate that, well, let me think about this. This is how I would do this. And if possible, can I give you an example of where I would have done something similar? So if you pick one that is quite common, where maybe you become aware that a colleague is maybe not in a position to be at their best on a particular day, maybe you notice something about them, whether they're tired or upset or whatever. And the way you should structure that answer is that, first of all, you need to talk back to basics. So you almost say, well, look, in any situation like this, the most important thing is patient safety. So you think about what the guiding principle is. And then you walk through what you would do in that situation. And you should be looking at what is the best practice. What have you seen your colleagues do? What do you know is the appropriate way to sensitively but firmly address a situation that you come up against? And if possible, give an example. And it doesn't have to be an example, as Lorcan has mentioned, that is game-changing, but it should be something that demonstrates that maybe with a junior colleague you were able to step in, make a decision, make sure that the patient safety was not compromised. That's evidence that you can do that again. In a communication scenario, you go back to your principle. Well, what is the principle? The patient needs to know certain information to make an informed decision. This is the process I would follow to make sure I'm happy that they have the information. And let me give you a sense of where I would have done something similar before. So it's thinking about those situations where you would have had to maybe step outside your comfort zone and maybe do things or follow up on things that would not be normally part of the strict job description, but there are things that any medical profession needs to be able to do well and without hesitation to be good at the job.
And questions like that aren't necessarily based on your educational qualifications or your clinical experience, but more your ethics and the approach you would take to certain situations. Lorcan, are there any other situations which people should prepare for like that?
No, there's been a pretty good swathe of them covered there, and I think it's about not necessarily thinking of it as, can I prepare for absolutely every single question that can come up, every single scenario when you're preparing for an interview. One of the key things that people don't fully realize in interviews is that they're more proactive interactions than they feel sometimes. So that it's not necessarily like a tennis match where balls are being fired at you and you're just trying to hit them back over. It's more proactive. It's what do you want to achieve? What do you want to get across? So that you can see 60-70% of an interview coming, of the content you're going to give, the examples you want to use, the opening question that we talked about or was talked about in the last episode. You can see all of these coming, and so you should be ready for them and you should have them practiced. But similarly with the scenario questions, there are the ones that are likely to come up that have been discussed. Other ones might come up, but you should remember the structure of how you approach them, which is, here's how I would do it as if I'm in the job, and here's an example of doing something similar before, as Barry said. So even if you are blindsided by a scenario you weren't ready for, the structure still applies. And if you get in the habit in your preparation of talking through the structure, you'll be absolutely able to do it on the day. Because in your preparation, you can end up going down this black hole of what if, and forget about, what do I want to say? What do I want to get across? What stories must I use? And if you get into that black hole of the what ifs, you'll end up eating up all of your time on questions that are very unlikely to come up and not devoting attention to the content you're definitely going to say. It's like if you had an exam and you had 10 questions in the exam and you knew what 8 of them were going to be and 2 of them could come from the whole syllabus. Well, you'd focus on the 8 that you knew were coming up. An interview is similar.
So if you had a client and you could only give them one key piece of advice to prepare for competency questions, Barry, what would it be?
Know the competencies, have very good examples that are practiced, that have a clear outcome, and that you can demonstrate that you were able to prove, as Lorcan says, your competence, your skill, and that you are essentially experienced and have a safe pair of hands when it comes to dealing with that particular issue. And if you can practice that, if you can get comfortable saying it, and everyone has their own way of speaking, but if you get into a position where you can say it a few times, that you're not saying it for the first time in the interview, it's like anything you practice to become good at. The more often you do it, the more likely you are to remember it under pressure.
And Lorcan, what would you advise?
Never script your answers. So it's exactly what Barry said. It's verbal preparation, verbal practice. In my experience, people preparing for these interviews are very comfortable writing. They're very comfortable writing things down and trying to learn them off and regurgitating them. It's a totally different scenario. You need to not script. You need to talk. It's your story. It's your life. It's your career. It's the job you're applying for. Back yourself to say it, but not for the first time. Talk it out. Get it conversational. Say it in the interview. So do not script your answers. Talk them out.
Great stuff. Thank you, Barry and Lorcan. Thanks for listening to episode 2 of the Pfizer Pro podcast. In our next episode, we'll be discussing what the approach and expectations of an interview panel might be for consultant or specialist registrar role, as well as self-care and stress management on approach to an interview. That episode is available now on pfizerpro.ie.